Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the interdisciplinary series on monitoring and evaluation for international development. When we were thinking of interesting speakers to invite to this talk, one of the first names that came to mind was Dean Karlan for the really innovative work he's been doing around the world in designing and conducting very rigorous research in throughout how many countries, you said?
Me or
Innovation. So
Innovation for Action is 45 countries.
45 countries.
But
so
I'm not
he
doing 45
is the founder
countries.
of Innovations for Poverty Action, which is based in New Haven, Connecticut, and describes himself as an open-minded behavioral development economist.
Open-minded development
economist.
I'm just equating behavioral economics to being open-minded.
And has substantial years of experience working in this field, and we're very excited about his talk today called The Goldilocks Problem, which he's told us he's never given before. So we are the first audience for this, which is very exciting. So please join me in welcoming Dean Karlan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. So, as you mentioned, this is a very different style talk in that I'm not presenting to you kind of a research project per se. There is a book that I'm working on with Mary Kay Gugerty at the University of Washington that is titled The Goldilocks Problem. And that is the heart of what I want to share with all of you. And frankly, at this point, really, my goal in presenting this is very much not about putting forward ideas, but about getting ideas. So I'm really keen to hear, particularly in this kind of interdisciplinary crowd, what people think of what I'm about to say. But this is not a technical talk. I'm not going to go into details of any one project in a very kind of linear fashion. So I want to talk more about an overall framework that we're thinking about and give you some concrete examples. So to just kind of go through a brief overview. So I'm going to do 4 things. I first want to talk a little bit, and my apologies in advance if the first part of this, you guys look at me like, I can't believe you're talking about these things in this kind of definitional kind of way. But I want to talk a little bit about monitoring versus evaluation versus research, what each is, and then where it all fits into what we've been working on. And the second is really a direct segue to the right fit M&E, is what we're referring to as the Goldilocks problem. The Goldilocks problem, so we all know the fairy tale, but the point as applied to monitoring and evaluation is that there's a big push these days from a lot of places, and I think it's right to say this is an upward push. It's not just that we're toward more data, more evidence. And I've seen many situations where I would say that the push from the donor or from whoever it is was too much. And usually in many audiences, people are shocked to hear me say that because I'm a researcher, I'm a data guy, so like that seems kind of weird and not what people expected when I say, no, don't do any research there, don't collect data, that's a waste of money. You're going to spend 15% of your budget on that when you could be giving out 15% more bed nets, give out the more bed nets, and don't do any research. That's just an example, right? So the point is about the Goldilocks problem is how to get it right. When is too much? When is too little? And figuring that out. And that's what we mean by the right fit M&E. And the reason we struggled a lot with this, how to get the words right, and we're not totally locked in on this because the book is still in draft. But the reason for right fit is because the answer with Goldilocks was like the analogy in some senses misses a little bit of a beat, in that the answer in Goldilocks was to get it in the middle, right? But that's not the answer in M&E work, right? It's not to say that there's some middle answer that's always right. Sometimes 0 is right. Sometimes a ton is right. Sometimes it's in the middle. It's about a right fit. So we kind of are deviating from the Goldilocks answer by answering that the answer is about right fit. But we like the Goldilocks analogy, so we're sticking with it. And then I'm going to give you a case study of one of the things we're doing. So one of the things that we did as part of the background, and I put research in quotes here because this is not research that's at least research in the way that economists think of research. It's not leading to particular research study or paper or journal article, but it's research in the sense that we've been working on the ground in Uganda to develop some case studies and thinking about what half a dozen organizations are doing and struggling with as they face M&E decisions. And I'll walk you through one of the examples of what an organization was doing, what we're advising them to do. And so that project has two parts. One is an advocacy piece, sort of, where we're basically working with an organization, providing consulting services to them about how they can do M&E better, which is outside the scope of research, right? That's like an NGO providing a service, basically. But we're doing it, and we're documenting it, and we're writing it up in a way that hopefully others can learn from, and that's for the Goldilocks book. Right, so the book has an overarching framework, but then has a series of case studies saying, let's now apply this to these NGOs and tell you about what they're doing. So I'll walk you through a little bit about one. So here's my Venn diagram of the day for you. And I think there's things that fit into all 7 of these cells. But it's really helpful for separating out and thinking clearly about what we mean by these different terms. So I think in the annals of evaluation, monitoring and evaluation practice, somebody somewhere did the world a great disservice by combining the two into the phrase M&E, monitoring and evaluation. And we've ended up with this massive blur, and this blur both in substance and in budgets. So in substance, we've ended up with this blur where there's countless organizations doing monitoring work and calling it impact, doing impact work without proper monitoring, and it's just a big blur. It's to understand what is the exact purpose of what you're doing with that information and where is it going. And then in budgets too, there's a blur where they're lumped together and they should be thought of as two separate things. They're two separate investments. One is about accountability and the other is about learning. And the minute they come out of the same budget, they're fighting with each other for money, and that's not a good thing. They serve different purposes, and they should just be thought of as separate things. But that's the world we're in. So here's what I mean by the three terms. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial, but there are some things here that are important, I think, to distinguish. So first, and I added a third one in here, research, which particularly given the crowd, that I think helps to illuminate. And let me be clear about one thing. This is a Venn diagram not drawn to proportion. Okay, so don't infer anything about the relative size of the overlaps in terms of what fits in there and whatnot. Okay, so by monitoring, simply put, I think of one phrase that to me summarizes what monitoring is, which is measuring what you're doing. Not what you're trying to achieve, not your objective, not your impact, but just measurement to document what you're doing. And there's two reasons to document that and to have data on what you're actually doing. One is accountability. You told a donor you're going to do something, here's the data to show you did it. Not, here's a donor which gave you money to reduce child mortality. Or here's a donor which gave you money to improve child literacy. No, here's a donor who gave you money to provide 47,542 hours of financial literacy training, and we did it. Okay? Here's a donor which gave us money to immunize 6,432 children, and we did it. Here's the numbers, here's the children that were immunized. That's accountability. And the second is about operations and improving operations. If you're Coca-Cola and you're running a sales team, you have data on what your sales team is doing every day. You know how many sales they made. You know how many visits they made. How many of their visits led to sales. How many did not. You keep track of this stuff. It tells you who to promote, who to fire. It tells you when you know as a proportion of convenience stores what your sales are, and you see a gap. You know, okay, maybe the salespeople are doing well, but I haven't allocated enough salespeople to that area. It gives you data which helps you make management decisions, and in that sense, it's no different. You're running an NGO, you're running the government, you need data to help guide you in making sure that you're running your business efficiently. And that's no different now than a firm that needs data. But the thing there is to make sure that the data have a decision tree to it that leads you to different decisions. That's the single, if there's one question, and one question only, that I always ask organizations when I'm in this kind of space of trying to think about what their right monitoring evaluation is write out a decision tree for me, show me that all paths don't lead to the same action. The minute they all lead to the same action, you're wasting money. Right? So, and this is unfortunately the way it often works. Like, if nothing is going to change in the way you do what you're doing, then don't spend money collecting data just to keep doing the same thing you're always doing. Right? So it needs to be that you're collecting data that tells you, if it looks this way, then I will allocate more employees to this region. That's a decision that can change based on the information you get. And this might sound really stupid, but that's not the way this always works. And it doesn't. The data do not always give you that answer that you would need. It's not always provided to the right person within the organization who can then take that data and act on it. So it's all about actionability, basically, making sure that all data are actionable, and if not bother collecting it, because it's then wasting time and resources. Not just the time to collect, but the mental energy to look at it. And that's the scary part. The scary part is when I sit through meetings and people are sitting there poring over reports on data where there's no actionability. And it's just like satisfying intellectual curiosity for the sake of curiosity. And that's not what NGOs and government should be doing. Okay, so that's what we mean by monitoring. Impact evaluation is how have lives changed compared to how they would have changed had we not done what we did. Right? That's impact evaluation. Right? And the whole point of that is the second part of that question. That's what makes it hard. That's what gives us all jobs in social science. If all we had to do was follow people over time to measure how they did, that would be easy. But the whole point is we need to figure out what would have happened to them had this thing not happened. That's the counterfactual. That's the hypothetical. And that's the whole motivation for doing things like running randomized trials or fancy econometrics to try to figure out what would have happened. And that often makes or breaks the difference between a credible study and a not credible study, is have you successfully tackled that counterfactual question? So we'll get into a little bit about that, and I'll give you some examples. I was told to expect a certain level of kind of understanding in terms of the motivations of randomized trials, so I'm not going to go into details on that, but I am happy to talk about randomized trials in developing countries and how you do them and things of that nature, because my understanding was that people are kind of familiar with them, but more in the US context, and so we can talk about some of the realities of doing them in developing countries too. And then research. So research is about knowledge creation, right? It's perfectly viable in many situations to do an impact evaluation when you're doing it for an accountability purpose, in the sense that you want to make sure that your program all in worked and did achieve its goal. So you need that counterfactual measured. But there's two scenarios in which it is what I would not say is research. One is when we already know the answer. Right? Now, we're borderline. There might be situations in there where the answer is you shouldn't be doing a randomized trial then. There's the one scenario where that we do see where you still might want to do a randomized trial is when there's politics involved, where sometimes a program is protected by a randomized trial in terms of its legacy, because in that context, showing that program and those people in that organization was able to execute a change will help keep that alive from a funding perspective. And even if it's something we know works, it can use the randomized trial to kind of defend itself and defend its legacy and stay alive. And so there's political reasons sometimes to do them, even if the knowledge is there. But the other thing that we face a lot are programs evaluations, where we're measuring did it work, but it's a little bit amorphous why. And there's lots of things that the program is doing, and so we're not going to be able to give a very crisp answer to why something worked. We're going to be able to answer the question that it worked. And so we can give you kind of the bottom line. And that organization can use that to go fundraise and expand and say, look, we did this in 20 villages. There's 2,000 more villages that are exactly the same. So we don't really need to know too much about the why, because we're just going and expanding in the same exact geographic area, same context. And so we proved our concept. We proved we can do our job. Now give us more money so we can expand. And that's a good, healthy thing to have happen. Right? But now, if that program is working in rural Nigeria, and we want to take that idea and go to India or go to Ecuador, we need to know a little bit more about why it worked. What were the underlying factors that were really important for its success? What was the market failure that existed in the first place that made this policy be a successful policy? And for that, we need to have a better theory. And so that's part of what I'm distinguishing from research from evaluation. So we might be able to set up a good, clean, randomized trial, treatment control, sample size is there, everything's nice and clean, we measure the right thing, and we can answer that it worked. But we don't have a good, clean answer of why it worked, because we did 7 things all at once in our program. And so all I can tell you is the package of 7 things had an impact, and it was worth it. But now when we go to Ecuador, and you tell me, I don't know that 3 and 5 are needed in Ecuador, was it really needed in Nigeria? And I can go, I don't know. We didn't test that. We tested the 7 together. So that's the difference between research, in which we're testing theories cleanly, and evaluation, where we're just answering the more monolithic question, did it work? And so that's why I distinguish that. There's also a very key operational difference between the two, and I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. There's a lot of research projects where we're doing a test of a theory. It's not a program we're evaluating, it's a theory. And it's a theory that's really important, that's at the root of lots of programs and lots of ideas and lots of policies. But at the end of the day, the thing we're actually testing is itself not a policy. But we're going to use that information to guide us in decision making. The example I'm going to give you is a rainfall insurance study we did. So the theory we wanted to test is, does risk hinder investment for farmers? And that's a theory. We test it by relaxing people's, by giving them rainfall insurance to help mitigate risks. Right? That wasn't done under the umbrella of a program. It's not hard to go from what we did do to a program, but what we did was not a program. We did it on our own as researchers, and just that. It's not what I would call a program. As researchers, it's actually much easier to do those types of studies, because things are more kind of within your control. You don't have as many parties at the table to be negotiating and constantly discussing all sorts of details. You just have a budget constraint and the realities of working in the field that you have to deal with. So that's an example of kind of testing a theory, whereas with a randomized trial versus testing whether something works and then trying to go from that, using your data, using your understanding of the context to build a theory that you're testing. So I'll give you an example of a project that's more in that spirit. Okay. So this due for effort. We forgot my iPad keeps turning off, so our system isn't quite perfect. So in the monitoring space, we have 2 types of things that are often done. We have monitoring as well as process evaluation type questions. So process evaluation questions might be questions that are research, but they're research about how organizations behave, and it's research about how to scale up and how to monitor your employees and things of this nature. And so when we think about the kind of the overall process of any sort of organization, we have inputs and outputs and then outcomes. Right? And outcomes are about the impact evaluation. It's about saying, did we actually improve financial literacy, or did we improve literacy, or did we make people healthier? Inputs and outputs, right? Inputs are we went and immunized children. Outputs are how many children, maybe that analogy doesn't quite work in that context, but outputs in that context is very specific about the numbers of things we actually did do. We immunized this many children. Inputs is the shot. Whereas outcomes is child mortality, right? And so we might have lots of questions that are about what we did and how we did it in the monitoring and process evaluations that are very different than the outcomes. And it's important to draw that line and be clear about what's what. And that's actually going to be a guiding principle when we get to the case studies, is really helping organizations see that line and understand when to just not ask. And it's hard for a lot of groups, at least the conversation I've had. People want to know their impact. And when you can't ask it, there's still a desire to say, well, maybe I'll just still follow them anyhow. And it's like, why? What are you going to do with that? It's not going to change your decisions. The one thing that's important to recognize, and this goes to this actionability issue, is that organizations have high degrees of control over the inputs and outputs, but not as much over the outcomes. And so there's a natural tendency to want the outcome psychologically. As leaders of these organizations, we're driven by the outcomes. We're driven by our wanting to make an impact on things. But the reality is the data that are most useful and most actionable are the ones we have control over. And that's on the inputs and the output side. And so there's this little disconnect between what people want and what donors want and what actually is the right data. And this is important to try to drive home, and that's one of the hearts of this project. I said this slide already. So the point is, with impact evaluations, we have to answer this counterfactual. And that counterfactual does not come out of the operations of an organization. That comes out of collecting data on non-participants, preferably through a randomized trial. And the reason for doing this type of thing, very simply put, very nice simple graph to just give this point, is that if we just follow people over time, we have some outcome. People are trending up. There's an intervention. People continue to go up, and whatever that outcome is. And we want a simple study which followed people over time would erroneously take this and conclude a huge impact. Whereas in the counterfactual, there was this trend. People were doing better anyhow over time. So there's still a positive impact in what I'm showing here. But the improvement is the yellow to the blue. The impact, that's the impact. The impact is not the yellow to the yellow that intersects with the red, right? Which is what you would get if you did a before-after kind of study. So that's the impact. And the basic problem is twofold: is not having proper controls for all of the things in the outside world that are influencing the outcome. So, if we're in the microfinance space, which is a space I do a lot of work in, and we're making loans to women who are starting small businesses, we're working with a lender. This lender says, I reach out to hardworking, enterprising people who are fighting their way out of poverty. And if you follow people before to after, you would find that their businesses got bigger. And, particularly if there's a good macroeconomic conditions in the environment. So how do we know that it wasn't just a good economy that helped them do better? Right? The first impact evaluation I ever saw of microcredit in El Salvador, reading this report I'm about to tell you, is what got me into doing what I do. It was 1992, and they did a report where they followed their people over time. And actually, I don't even think they followed them over time. I think they just asked them after the fact, is your business bigger than it was 2 years ago? And 90% of the people said yes. And so they said, great, this is our impact. We caused that to happen. And, macroeconomic conditions could have been good. And in fact, I think they were. I don't remember. But, let's say they were. And so they did better over time. They didn't ask them whether they were older than they were 2 years ago. But the same exact analytical rigor would conclude that microcredit causes aging. Right? But they were sane enough not to put that on the survey question and make that the headline of their report. But there's two basic issues. I already said one is the macroeconomic conditions. Could have just been good and people trended up. But the second, which is the deeper and the harder issue, is selection bias. Right? So I told you these programs are seeking out hardworking, enterprising people. So if we took this room and we divided it in half, the hardworking people and the less than hardworking people, we'll say, who's going to do better over time in whatever journey you're on? Well, the hardworking people. That's kind of what we mean by being hardworking. We think there's returns to the hardworking, being a hard worker. And so, of course, they're going to do better over time. So we can't just evaluate the program by comparing the people who join the lending program to the people who don't. We already said that the people who join are hardworking people. They're going to do better over time. So that's kind of stupid. So we know that's a problem. And that's the second issue that we get at and that's the second challenge with an evaluation, and that's the whole motivation for doing random assignment. So this is, hopefully the part that's near and dear to everybody, but, the basic point is creating two groups that do not differ systematically at the outset so that we can attribute the change in people's lives to the program or the policy. And obviously I'm just speaking in very abstract ways. There's a lot of different studies that we're engaged in that are measuring the impact of something. And there are other ones that are just measuring the relative impact on doing it one way versus another, or measuring the sensitivity to price, selling things at different prices, trying to understand what the demand is. So there's lots of things to ask using the same basic technique. We know, the same basic process we would apply in a medical trial is exactly what we do in developing countries, but it's just there's a lot more variety, I think, in terms of how we end up creating samples. So sometimes there's a naturally created sample because we're working with an organization and we're just testing something within what they're doing and adding something. Sometimes it's a clustered study where we're randomizing over villages. And then nobody is participating in a study per se. We're just randomizing over villages in which some villages will be offered a service and some not. Right? And so it's voluntary. People in the treatment group can join or not. They're just in the village that happens to get the service from this NGO or government, and people in the control group can hunt it out as they wish. No one can stop them from, for instance, if we're working with a bank that's making loans, and they could make it so that the people in the control group can still hunt out and find loans. They can certainly borrow from places that we're not working with. We can't stop that. Right? So what you're doing is you're just creating differential access in some areas with higher access, some with lower access. So there are a lot of studies that are open like that are where it's more kind of quote voluntary, and then there's other studies that are much more tightly controlled. 1,000 people apply for a scholarship to a school that has 500 scholarships to dole out. We dole out 500 scholarships, and we follow the 1,000 people, but everybody knew that they were signing up for something that had an explicit lottery to it, and some will win and some will not, and we follow people. So there's many spectrums in terms of levels of intrusion that the research takes place. And frankly, as a side note, which we won't go into, I think there's a lot of work we need to understand more about on a methods perspective, about how different levels of intrusion matter to the integrity of the research, and what are ways of doing it that are good, and what are the risks we need to be aware of. So there's three big picture issues when we get at impact evaluation that we need to be focused on, and this does lead directly back to the Goldilocks question, because the point is these are not questions that are the types of things you get from monitoring data. So first, as a broad-based point, a lot of policies we're setting, whether it's not necessarily about allocation of resources, but laws. Regulation on things like, so when I look at MySpace, things like regulation on interest rates. We have very little information about what the impact would actually be from putting in caps on interest rates. But yet there's a lot of interest all over the world of doing that in different disclosure policies. So there's a lot of need for just evidence-based policy. It's not necessarily just about, should I run this program or that program? But then there's also key issues about efficiency. We have different ways of solving problems. We know that. What's the most efficient way of doing it? What's the most cost-effective way of doing it? And lastly, from the philanthropy space in the United States and across the world when we're dealing with philanthropy, there's huge questions to be had about where the money can do the most good. One question which I get asked a lot as a big picture is, does aid work? Right? And this is just a horrible question. Because obviously the answer is sometimes. It's too obvious an answer, but yet somehow that's the level of debate that we've had for many decades. And so this work that we're building off of here is really all about saying, look, that's just not the right question. The right question to ask is, does this program work, and if so, why? And does it have legs where we can take that lesson and move it elsewhere? That's the right question. And we need to start much, much more micro. We're not going to answer the question about what the impact is of the U.S. government's aid budget. But we can answer the question as to whether this program over here that was done last year, did it have an impact? What was it? And why did it work? We can make a stab at that so that we can then see whether we should take that idea and move it and expand it. Okay. So, within the impact evaluation space, to be clear, RCTs are obviously just a piece. And, one of the things I want to talk through is, what we often will do when you can't measure the counterfactual with a randomized trial. No, I promised I wouldn't go into a technical thing. So there's certainly non-randomized trial methods of trying to get at a counterfactual. In my experience, a lot of times that we're facing the constraints of not being able to do a randomized trial, it's not that we're facing an organization or a problem that is so unique that the answer is, you know what, here's another method we can use that requires making some more assumptions we hope are right, but we don't have as clean a way of knowing, because it's so important that we need to measure the counterfactual in this context. More often, what I'm faced with is the answer is, okay, let's just not answer this question here. This is not the right, if you're not producing If you don't believe in external validity of anything, then you should never do this stuff. Right? So let me just give you a very concrete example of what I mean by this is, let's say an organization came to me and said, we want to do an impact evaluation of our microcredit program. So we've done microcredit evaluations. There have been 6 randomized trials on this. They're actually, all 6 have found more or less the same results. And let's say you're an organization that's really small, and you're working in 5 villages and 500 households, and we did our sample size calculations, our power calculations, and we just said, you know what, you do not have the power to do a good study here. We can't do it. And so they said, okay, well, let's do something non-experimental. That's exactly the moment I would say, okay, well, why? We could, you know what, this is actually maybe a bad example, because we had 6 studies. So let's go to a different example. Let's say we don't have studies on the question, but someone says to us, we want to test out X, we're working in 5 villages, and there's another organization that's doing the same thing in 500 villages. So the right answer is to turn the group that's working in 5 villages and saying, just don't do this. There's a group over there that's doing it with 500 villages. The context is the same. There's nothing unique about what you're doing versus what they're doing. So if they test it and find that the idea works, you can run with that. That's evidence for you. That shows your idea worked. Now the only thing you have to validate is that you're doing what you said you'd do. So don't do a randomized trial because you can do it over there. The context in which we kind of change our standards away from the randomized trial is when it's truly just unanswerable with a randomized trial. It's just not, you just can't do it. It's not that the stars weren't aligned with that organization. It's just that it's not possible. So I'm going to give you 2 very simple examples of this. One is, suppose you're doing research that's in a post-conflict area or in the middle of a conflict, and it's just total chaos. Right? The systems there, the war and the issues around the war are so devastating that the idea of running a controlled process, and to be clear, we have run randomized trials in post-conflict settings, so it's not impossible to do that, but the stars have to be aligned, it has to be certain things. You could easily imagine a situation where you want to do something in some sort of humanitarian work, it's maybe post-conflict, maybe it's post-disaster, and you know, when you say to someone, okay, let's randomize exactly how we roll out this refugee camp, they look at you like, what, are you insane? You can't randomize that, but at the same time, you know, there might be some other method that you can try to do to try to get that counterfactual. That's not something where you can say, okay, you know, this hurricane is not well suited for randomized trial, but hurricanes in general can do them, so let's go elsewhere. Right? That's stupid. But you can say, like, look, this rural area has this level of malnutrition, and you're working with 5 villages, so don't do a randomized trial because there's thousands and thousands of villages that are rural with malnutrition, and that's all you need to do your study. So let's go elsewhere. In the malnutrition case, but in the hurricane case, no, there's no post-hurricane disaster that is going to be well suited for testing the idea and testing the question. So that's one where you just, if you're going to do it, you have to relax the standards. Now I forget. I had a second thought I wanted to say, and now I dropped it. I don't remember. I'll come back to it. Okay. What? No. We're not the end. What did I hit? Okay. Here was the second issue. It's on here. It's the separable units. So the second setting in which we will find often the need to deviate, it has to do with the second issue, with severable units. So there's many ideas out there where it's just not possible to separate out into separable enough units that you can run a randomized trial, right? I mean, you have to randomize over some units. Now, there's a lot of things out there that have spillovers, right? And some of that can be really exciting if it's actually part of the program, intentionally or unintentionally, but part of what really happens in life. Then measuring that is actually important for getting your evaluation right, and it's certainly possible within a randomized trial to measure spillovers. So a very simple example of that, not me as a researcher, but other researchers that are part of IPA, did research on deworming, where they basically, to make a long story short, were able to test schools that were untreated with deworming that happened to be close to schools that were treated to schools that were not treated, that were very far from schools that were treated. So we have two control groups. One control group is indirectly treated by being near treated kids, and the other one is thoroughly untreated by being nowhere near treated kids. So no one gets the treatment, and we get to find out, is there a spillover? And there was, and it made a big difference on the cost effectiveness of deworming school children. Right? So that's a simple design where spillovers occur. Units are not fully separable, but there's some decay to the spillover in terms of the geography, and so you can use that in the design of the study. But you could easily imagine other things where the decay geographically is so big that that's just not possible. Take something that is at the country level that you're doing, it's just not going to be possible. So that might be an obvious setting where you just cannot use a randomized trial. It's just not possible. So it's not a matter of like, go look somewhere else where you can have the right setting. It's just like, no, that research question just can't use that technique, and that's that. And so now, if you really think it's important to do this, you're going to have to figure out some other way, some non-experimental method. Okay, so those are the two scenarios in which we still tackle the impact evaluation question, and we still want to, but deviate from randomized trials. Some practical issues, though, that are very relevant when we're dealing with developing countries. One is budget. As a side note, I don't usually find when we work out a budget on a randomized trial that it's actually more expensive than non-experimental but survey-based methods. So if you're going to follow people over time and compare them to people who are not in a program and follow them over time, you're still doing lots of survey work. The randomized trial is not what adds money to a budget. It's the measuring people that adds money to the budget. The random assignment actually allows you to use a lower sample size if you're comparing to non-participants, because you don't have to model selection. And so it actually can be cheaper. But regardless, the point is, a lot of times people say, oh, randomized trials are so expensive. And I'm always like, no. Randomization is really cheap. It's surveying that's expensive. And so it's just, that's all. And using a non-randomized method that still does tons and tons of survey work is going to cost as much, if not more, as a randomized trial. And the other reason why it's actually cheaper, too, is because a really nice randomized trial often gets to free ride off of university endowments, as in you get professors for free. Right? So, very, very little of my work is my time ever charged, right? I'm lucky and Yale pays my salary and that's that. And so, a lot of faculty are exactly in that situation. And so when it's good research that a professor is going to get excited about and further, that actually can be done more cheaply than hiring consulting firms who have to have all their salaries covered. Okay. So the practical issues are about budget and about capacity to do it well. One of the main reasons why I started Innovations for Poverty Action was realizing that here we were, a bunch of economists getting our feet wet, running randomized trials in developing countries, using a revolving door, at least in the very beginning days, of graduate students who are really brilliant mathematicians and data analysts and theorists who have an interest in doing things that are practical on the ground. But at the end of the day, we're trained in grad school in how to do data analysis and theory and proofs, not about how to manage 30 surveyors and design surveys and do these things. And the partner management that goes along with doing this type of field work is not the comparative advantage of the typical graduate student, at least not in economics. And so one of the two reasons I started Innovations for Poverty Action back in 2002, we were first called Development Innovations when we first got created, was to provide that type of on-the-ground field support to make sure that the randomized trials happen well. The second reason was to make sure that the results see the light of day, that it doesn't just become a revolving door padding CVs of academics, but that we have an entity whose mission is not about research, but is about policy change. And so making sure that that research, once it's done, is carried forward in whatever the most appropriate way is. Okay, so the design issues to deal with in terms of deciding about when a randomized trial is appropriate. Sample size is probably the single biggest deal breaker that we face when talking with organizations. Lots of enthusiasm from lots of groups. We saw this report. We love this paper. This really excited us. We're doing something similar. We want to see our program evaluated in this way, and they just don't have the sample size, and that's that. And oftentimes I think that's the single biggest mistake that people make is marching ahead anyhow. And then you have an underpowered study, and you end up with kind of these weak results, and then it makes everyone twist around their heads trying to interpret them, and it's very hard. The timing obviously has to be right. I see less of this these days. I think I'm proud to say I think that's a sign of our success and that more people are familiar with what a randomized trial is. But I have vivid memories of some early conversations with organizations that had already done what they wanted to do, and then came to us and said, "Great, now let's do a randomized trial." And we said, "But you've already rolled out your program." And they said, "That's right. Can't you just randomize now?" And and we had to explain, no, you've already done it. You can't, And there was a lot of confusion sometimes between random assignment and random selection. They're like, "Yeah, we already rolled it out to 10,000 people. Don't you just randomly choose 1,000 now and interview them?" Which is obviously, as everybody knows here, fundamentally different than randomly assigning people to treatment control. The only thing in common with these two concepts is they both have the word random in it. But yet, that is a very common confusion that I actually think I'm seeing less of, at least in my interaction, which might be a byproduct of our success. I don't mean our personally, just the overall industry success in seeing this happen. It might be my own ignorance here, and it just might be that I'm engaged in fewer first-level conversations with organizations. I see one of my former team members laughing as I said this, because she's one of the people that would often front those conversations, and so I didn't have as many of them. So maybe they're still happening, and I'm just not a party to them as much. So the last point is about proof of concept. And this goes to the point about knowledge. I gave you an exception about political issues when you want to do randomized trials, but certainly in terms of proof of concept, we want to do randomized trials when there's actually knowledge that needs to be had, right? We don't already have evidence. We're not going to go do a randomized trial on immunizations that have already been proven. We might run it on how to get people to do their immunizations. That we don't have good evidence on, right? But we're not going to actually do a test on the immunization itself if it's already been thoroughly vetted. So there needs to be, the timing to do a randomized trial is when you actually need knowledge about the proof of the concept. The one exception I will make to that is this political issue that does pop up here and there, where particularly in the government context, where if you're running a government program and you want to make sure that your program survives politics, then a randomized trial can actually help with that. That was actually one of the motivations for doing a large randomized trial in Mexico called Progressa, that researchers got involved in and did a randomized trial. And the person who started this, his exact motivation, at least as it reported to me, was wanted to have a randomized trial of this program because wanted to make sure that if the party in power changed, that there was really clear documentation that all the powers can be, and that it could be blasted all over the media, that this thing worked. So that if the politics changed and the different political party was in power, it would be difficult for them to cancel the program, which is a typical thing that happens in politics. When the new party comes in, they kill off all the old party's programs and start their own things. And so, and that's exactly what happened. A new party came in, and the program survived. The funny part, I think, is that they changed the name so they could rebrand it, but the program survived. And so it's a nice story of that kind of. Yeah. So when not to run one, I kind of hit on these, so I'll go quickly. But when the answer is already known, it's the opposite of everything I just said. When the answer is already known, when sample size is too small, when the spillovers are so huge so you really don't have any separability. Note that that's kind of the same thing as saying the sample size is too small, right? So if the spillover is so huge that it's the entire country, another way of saying that is, okay, we just don't have enough countries that we can get to participate in a study and randomize over countries, because that's kind of crazy, the idea of running a randomized trial in that way. And lastly, when no more money, I should add the word more, when no more money is going to be spent on the program, I don't mean just that program, but just in general, right? I don't have an example of that being the case in anything, but you could easily imagine that being the case. Actually, that's not true. I have one example of that. I don't know if this is right. It's not my exact space, but I heard it in this context. Guinea worm in northern Ghana. Huge eradication effort to get rid of guinea worm. But in most parts of the world, it's almost gone. Huge efforts to get it to zero. And the idea of doing a randomized trial on that was kind of like, why? Like, everyone knows how to get rid of it. They know they run the campaigns. They're working on it. It's not done, but they're working on it. But pretty soon, in northern Ghana, I think they are now saying they're done. And so then it'd be over, and there's no reason to know the impact of continue the eradication program. That doesn't make sense. I mean, the only reason to use it would be to motivate a further eradication in some other country, but all the powers that be seemed sufficiently motivated to do it. So it's not so clear why you want to bother measuring the impact of that unless you're just trying to be a historian and document the impact. Practical reasons. So these are particularly important and ones that we face in the realities of life. First of all, when the partner isn't particularly enthused about it, there's nothing worse than being in the middle of a randomized trial where the organization that's doing it is only doing it because they have to do it, because their donor is making them or someone's making them do it. That is almost always a recipe for disaster. It's a shame, but it is the reality, and it makes for not just a painful process, but often a failed process, often one that does not end in results where anybody believes the answer because there's been adulteration of the process along the way. When you don't have sufficient cash to do it right, there's a very practical reason. And when the timing isn't right to create the decent sample frame. I don't mean just the extreme case of they've already done it, but sometimes too we're faced with situations where it's just too rushed. Right, where the important questions you want to ask, you're going to need a baseline for, and there's just no time to do it. And so things are kind of too rushed. I meant to put this earlier, but here's a cartoon to wrap this all up for you. That is one of my favorite cartoons for class. There you go. Okay, here's my second cartoon for you. So now on to giving you some concrete examples. So this is the story of microcredit. I think of it as the masochist in the shower. So the idiot in the shower problem. The idiot in the shower problem is when you get in the shower and it's really brutally hot, and then you turn on the cold water and it gets really brutally cold, and then you swing it back and it's now too hot and you can't get it right. And that's basically what the rhetoric has been like in microcredit, where we had everything going from the Nobel Peace Prize. Microcredit is wonderful. It's saving the world. That's a bit extreme, but still, Nobel Peace Prize, millions of people are getting out of poverty. All the way to microcredit is bad. People are getting over indebted. They're loaded up with debt. They don't need the debt. They're not realizing what they're taking out. Then they have to pay these things back. All the way to extreme examples of people arguing that people were killing themselves in India because of microcredit. We had this huge pendulum swing. The answer, of course, was that the results were mediocre, but not uninteresting, not unimportant. There was some investment, some risk mitigation. People were better off on average. I mean, all 6 studies that we've seen now are kind of smack in this kind of zone of the world's a better place, but it's not solving poverty. Don't use it as your poverty alleviation tool, but certainly do what we can to facilitate the investment in further microcredit. But also we've seen strong evidence for insurance, for risk and savings both out of these studies and out of similar studies. And so this is the studies that are showing about microcredit. This is the reason I put these in here. I wanted to give it as an example of an impact evaluation study. It's not to say there isn't some theory about why it's going to work, but it's very much about working with a lender that's doing something, randomizing their villages that they go into. Some get the microcredit, some don't. We follow people over time, but it's very much integrated with a lender that's running their business. Right? And so then the second example I wanted to give you was something that came out of this, in a sense. So there's been a lot of focus on agricultural credit in the world. The idea that farmers are not investing as much in their farms because they don't have money. It's one of the ideas that one of the reasons why microcredit is often pushed in rural areas is the idea is to getting farmers access to credit. So this is an example of a research study, not an impact evaluation, but one that fits in that other Venn diagram box of research, where we wanted to say, okay, let's test that theory. Let's go and find out what happens if we offer people rainfall insurance. So the idea here is we weren't working at first with an insurance company or doing anything that formal. We just wanted to go and say, look, here's how this is going to work. We're going to give you the following amounts of money if rainfall is if there's a drought or if there's a flood. And then we measured whether that inspired people to invest more money in fertilizer and things like that. And what we found was when we just mitigated that risk, farmers were more likely to buy fertilizer and put it in their farm, to cultivate more land, to hire more people to work on their land. So all these things went up, investment went up. And what's striking is we gave them no money, right? So this is the thing, for these people, they might have been credit constrained because they pulled money from other places to pay for this. So there's some in the grander things, they do have capital constraints. It's not a perfect credit market, but it's not nearly as bad as people made it seem, because all we did is give them rainfall insurance, the promise of future money, And they came up with a lot of money to then invest more in their farms. So this is an example of testing a theory that has actually real policy implications. We're now in the field with insurance companies scaling this up throughout the entire country of Ghana. So it's taken the theory, it's established it, it's tested it, and now it's back in the program space. And we are doing research to help understand the impact of this as a program per se. So this is the ENR of microcredit motivated the R on the risk in farming. That was it. And the way we ran this experiment was as a randomized trial with these 4 groups. Some farmers got capital, some got insurance, some got both, and some got nothing. Okay, so let me explain this. This is, just as a side note, one of my favorite photos from this study. This is one of our, Mrs. Hakim, who works at IPA, and this is, as I think of it, the face of trust. So one of the big issues one of the big theories that we kind of realized and kind of tried zooming in on is what are the hindrances in the market for selling rainfall insurance? And one of the hindrances is trust. That people don't know whether to trust the rainfall insurance. So even though it worked, we did see problems in generating demand. And so this is Hakim, and that's a bag of money on his head. And there he is in the flood going to the village to give the payout. And so that is the face of trust. That's how we create trust. And we did see demand kick in, but we also did see demand kick in much more so after people got money in the prior year. So this is an important issue, an important theory about trust in markets that needs to be kind of figured out more to figure out how to scale this. So the one that's closer to the E, as an example I was going to give you, is the Hunger Project. The Hunger Project is doing a lot of things. So it's an interesting program, goes into a village, builds an epicenter. We're doing this 10-year randomized trial with them. But this epicenter has tons of activities going on. We have 36 different separable units, so to speak, which are very large, not just communities, but swaths, community clusters. And we're randomizing over these clusters. But there's a lot that goes into each of these epicenters. They're doing microcredit, they're doing ag extension work, they're running a child care, they're doing some child nutrition, it's all of it. I'm not going to be able to tell you too much about why it's working, if it works. Right? I'm going to be able to tell you about the monitoring data, to tell you what they did, and I'm going to tell you the all-in. Right? But you could easily tell me a story about child nutrition leading to better farm output because the children are healthier and able to work harder in the farm, about microcredit giving them access to capital that makes them invest more. All of these things have channels that are going to lead to various outcomes in theory. And I'm not going to be able to give you, when we have this report, a very clean, single story as to why this thing worked. But what we will be able to say is whether the package of all this stuff had an impact. So that's very much in the E space of evaluation. Okay. So then we're on to the Goldilocks problem, which I've kind of summarized in the beginning, that too much, too little, too hard, too soft, too hot, too cold, is the choices along the way, and we basically find ourselves in the same issue when it comes to development. That we're working with way too many organizations that are either doing nothing whatsoever on impact evaluation when they could be, that are trying to do impact evaluations when they can't for all the reasons we just went through. And so the challenge is getting the right system, hence the analogy. So let me give you the example I want to walk to. But the main things that we want to talk about, and when we think through how to design such a program for any organization, is about feasibility. What are the resources they have for actually collecting the data in a non-taxing way? And this actionability thing is, I think, the single biggest difference in what we're saying when we're talking with these organizations than what we see existing. Is really making sure that every single data point collected leads to at least 2 different actions. Can't lead to one, has to lead to at least 2. There has to be some division, something, some way that you're going to collect that information and it could lead to one of at least 2 paths. And that's, shockingly enough, a very simple way of putting what I see as the fundamental problem in a lot of the way this is done. And so that's been a lot of our focus. So we're supposed to go to 2, so I might jump out of the, what time am I supposed to go to? Till 2?
Normally till 2, but we can have it till 2:30.
Till 2:30. So I will, I was going to talk through this one example of this group in Uganda, or we can break to questions as everybody prefers. Do you have a preference? Okay.
I mean, people have to leave.
Should we take a break so if people had to leave, and then we can okay.
Why don't we compromise mini Uganda
Mini Uganda.
and then questions?
Great. Okay, so this was an NGO, which is a Western-based NGO, and basically they had been running these kind of pre-post surveys on their projects. So what they were doing was a household food security program, is what they called it. They distributed farm inputs to the beneficiaries, like seeds, small livestock, and tools. Not huge amounts of money, but decent amounts of money for some of this. $100 per household, right? So I've seen other programs that are kind of in this space of doing this type of thing where the value is much higher. They were teaching farmers, doing a lot of ag extension work. Their basic goal, if you ask them what their aspiration is, it was all about food security. It was kind of their driving outcome measure. So when they looked at the data that they were collecting, they were doing increased number of meals, increased food consumption, increased meals, including at least 3 food groups. And then they were looking at some process changes along the way, not from their perspective, but from the farmer's perspective in terms of the types of things they expect to see change, like crop yields, increased seed savings, increased livestock holdings, right? So these are intermediary process changes, things that should happen at the household level, but not process changes from the organization's level. So that process from the organization level would be about like number of households they reached and doled out the goats and stuff. So thinking through the feasibility, actionability of these different outcomes. So thinking through increased number of meals, including at least 3 food groups. So the first order thing to be asking is, what's the counterfactual here? Right? So what's the number, when you see that number go up, under what logic is are they going to change what they're doing? And the answer is, there isn't. You need to know the counterfactual to know whether when that number goes up by 2, is that a sign of success or failure? Right? I don't know. If it was a drought, that flat would be a huge success. Right? And so you just can't go from that data point to an action because you don't have the counterfactual. So that's an example of not to do that. So what if the beneficiary enrolled in a nutrition education program from another NGO? Is another outside factor that might be taking place, and we just don't know. So the number went up. And then what do you conclude from that? You have no idea. So that doesn't tell you an action as to whether to do more or not. So these are just other types of examples of what could, why it's a bad question without the counterfactual. So what can the NGO learn? Nothing, basically, without that counterfactual. So this is bad. So does the value justify it? Obviously, my point here is no. Number of livestock owned. It's going to have the same basic issues. Without a counterfactual, how are they going to attribute it? So, we have disease or drought. Other increases in income might allow them to buy the livestock that we have no idea about. Some other NGO also distributed livestock out in the communities. It has the same basic issue. I thought I had, why do I keep losing this? I thought I had a different slide in there where we went through. Oh no. So we lost the one slide, I thought. So there's one more slide, my apologies, but basically where we're walking through some of the types of things to collect, and this is where we've been working with this NGO to better document their actual actions, right? And thinking about it from a management's perspective. And I think the analogy is perfect to just draw the analogy to something like Coca-Cola. Right? What would Coca-Cola want to know about its distribution network if it was working in Uganda? They're out there distributing, information, and they're out there distributing livestock, and it would be the same thing. You would want to know, okay, I want to do a needs assessment, and then I want to know what we're doing. So I want to know that we're not distributing in places where there aren't as many poor. I want to target the areas that have ultra poor, And within those areas, I want to target the ultra poor. Right? So that means that I need to have some understanding of who are the people that we are reaching. That could call for some pre-data or some data that you might want to collect at the moment people are identified to be part of the program, so you can kind of map them to understand who you've reached. That's part of your mission. But then the second is just documenting that the transfers were made, and you could easily imagine an accountability step that takes place afterwards to document that the transfer happened. So you go to the farm, if you're doing ag extension work, teaching them about a particular way of growing their mace. You can imagine going a week later and seeing, are they doing it? Are they adopting the method you taught? Right? And that's immediate, and it's immediately afterwards. And it doesn't tell you the impact per se, but if you go and 20% of the farmers were adopting the technology before, and afterwards still it's only 20%, right? Only a week later, this can tell you right away that you didn't, it's like giving an exam, giving a lesson and then giving an exam immediately upon departure. And if nobody passes, then you don't need a randomized trial to know that you didn't do your job on that. So those are the types of measures that we've been working with them to try to build in along the way. Okay. So the overall punchline here, just to recap, is that while yes, randomized trials are the gold standard for measuring these types of things, it's not always the appropriate method, and that should lead us down one of two paths. One is not doing impact evaluations at all in some situations, or doing them when they are needed for the reasons we discussed in non-experimental methods. And the second is to focus more heavily on actionable data that organizations can use to help improve their operations, improve what they're doing, improve accountability and management of organizations. But to try to separate out that desire that we all have to measure impact from our desire to just run a good, clean, well-greased, well-functioning organization. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing I've always wondered about is if you get pushback from the non-treated villages, especially if it's close enough that people are aware that it's going on. I just wonder, especially if it's something that's considered a universal good that everyone wants access to, if you take a lot of abuse for not providing it to everyone.
Right. So the short answer is no, but let me explain why. I've yet to be personally in a study where we've seen it happen. I can't say that it's never happened to someone, right? But there's two things to keep in mind. One is that they don't always know. Right? There's ways. Sometimes that randomized trials are done. They're not done. They're done in a very kind of transparent way. But transparent not in the sense of everybody knows, but transparent in the sense that nobody knows. It's just built right into the operations of what an organization is doing. There's an organization. It's going to go to 500 villages. And so I guess to be clear, what I mean is it's transparent in that you can't see the randomization, not transparent in that the randomization is fully clear to everybody. So organization is going to go to 500 villages. That's nothing's changed. All that's changed is they didn't, in their head office, choose the 500. They chose 1,000, and then there was randomization, and they went to the 500. In that situation, the only contact with the control group is not from the organization, because they're not going there. The contact is from the surveyor and the researcher who's going and surveying them. But then now these are separated activities, and frankly, in an ideal world, they're fully separated. Because we don't want to go to the treatment people, too, and tell them, we're now doing the survey to measure the impact of that thing you just got. We want to go to them and just say, I'm a researcher doing a survey, studying households. Right? And there's a lot of questions in here. And I don't want to make that direct link, because I don't want to bias them into answering questions thinking, oh, this is about that thing I got. I better tell them how wonderful it is. I better tell them I'm making lots of money. Or I better tell them it's failed, because then they'll give me more. I don't know. You can imagine many distortions. So most of the time we do this, I try. But this is something we need more methods research on, is understanding these distortions, to separate. And in that situation, the issue in the control group is no different than the treatment group. The issue is going to be, will they put up with all your questions? And how are you going to compensate them for their hour of time, things like that. And that differs over different countries. Sometimes we're working with the government where they won't pay ever, because that's the rule. So there's different norms there. But the issue then is just getting people to participate in the survey, not the only time it then is a little differential is if you think the treatment does something like inspires people to move or not move, and then you have differential attrition that you got to think about and deal with. So that's the first answer, is that in many situations there is no kind of awareness of it. The second is when they are aware, a lot of times we do it in the fully transparent way where the randomization is actually fully explained, right? So we go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and we will work in a village. We have 10 things that we can give out. There's going to be 40 goats given out in clumps of 4 to 10 households. You go to the village, 10 households are going to win. You have 30 households that are eligible, and you hold a public lottery. And all the times we've done that, I've never had anybody say, well, that's not fair. Why don't you have 120 goats? It's like, well, because we don't. This is what we got. I think I was off on my numbers there. I've always been a little afraid of that, to be honest, that they don't then say, well, okay, but we're going to share ex post. So you can do whatever you want in your randomization, but we're dividing these goats up. Because you just told us that 1/4 of us are getting 4 goats, and we're not idiots. That means everybody can get 1 goat. I've never actually had that happen, but I've always been nervous about that in public lotteries, that will force more risk sharing than would happen naturally if the NGO just went in and found 10 households and doled out goats. Yeah.
This is, I think, somewhat related, but how do you tease apart some of the, I guess, non-tangible emotional effects of receiving a treatment? So, like if it was baby kits in rural Uganda, and it's a depressed mom, and so just having someone come and deliver something, it had this profound effect because she was feeling lonely, and now someone cares about her baby and her child, and it affects her pregnancy. Or it could be just having a box. You can imagine that there's so many pieces that you would have to create different arms of the RCT to test for, to be able to say that it's this particular, right? So how do you deal with that?
I think that you've answered it kind of. So first of all, you could. So you need there's 2 things I would say. One is you need to have a theory as to why this is working. And when you have a really tough question like okay, I really think the people part of this is really critical, to go with your example. But then you want to test that, then that's fine. That's 2 treatment arms. That's not so big a deal. But ultimately, of course, we always have more questions than we can possibly answer, right? It's easy to brainstorm a million variations and then say we test them all. But that's the role of the researcher, is to figure out which are the questions that are most important for understanding why this works, and what's the power calculation, how many treatment arms can I possibly get away with, and which ones are separable enough that I can do that way and which ones not. But that is, in some sense, that is the difference between good and bad research in this style, which is figuring out and having the judgment to know that actually the woman who goes and delivers the baby kit might be the absolute instrumental part of this, and so we can't do a randomized trial on this particular delivery process and then take that lesson and say, great, this works, and then call up Amazon and say, we have this great thing and you can do it, it's just you got to ship off these baby kits. And you got to have judgment to know that, no, actually, we think the human element of this was absolutely critical. And if you think it's that critical, then test that. Because clearly it'd be easier to do it by using Amazon. I mean, Amazon's probably a horrible example just because of the logistics, but you understand my point. Yeah.
When you're designing these things and you're figuring out, if you're doing a random control trial and you're trying to figure out sort of how many people to test and how many different villages to go to, does it factor in there how different the villages are, and how do you figure out which villages are equivalent to each other, and if it's like a really varied place, does that mean more village? Like, how do you go about thinking about that? Because I'm still trying to wrap my brain around you saying that RCTs are cheaper or can be cheaper. So how do you figure out how many different places you need?
So the first thing you have to ask, if you have a lot of, so the first question, I have kind of questions back for you, would be, one is, well, is that heterogeneity important across your villages? Is it that you have a theory that says the more rural, the more effective this will be? And I have heterogeneity in terms of how far from the road this village is. So I think it's going to have a treatment effect of 1 standard deviation really far, and something much smaller closer in, and I want to be able to test that heterogeneity. Right? If that's the case, then you need a large enough sample size to be able to test your treatment effect in the far villages and the close villages, and you need to do the math accordingly. But just having heterogeneity in terms of on various dimensions does not affect your sample size. I mean, that doesn't matter at all. This is just about needing enough groups that on average they're going to be the same on the outcomes that you care about. But you're always going to have variation. I mean, do any medical study in the United States, you don't have, people are different in a million ways, right? So it's perfectly fine to have groups that are different. What the point of a randomized trial is that on average, your groups on average become the same. Not that every unit is comparable and has a clone on the other side. That's totally unnecessary. So you don't need to match. You don't need to do that. You just need the simple sample size to go treatment control, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Building on that, maybe framing it in a different way. I remember back when I was an experimental psychology graduate student, we did randomized control trials. It's called experimental psychology. Control groups, generally composed of college sophomores from major research universities. And we published in those days textbooks on the way the brain works, the way people think, until about 20 years later when people started doing more studies outside of the United States and found that the universals, thought to be universals in psychology, based on college sophomores in Ann Arbor or other places, Berkeley, were only a small slice of the human pie. So and one has the impression, even in your talk today, that in the field of experimental economics or social experiments, that the people who talk about randomized controlled trials talk about it as if, you didn't make this claim, but it's as if the findings in a Uganda set of villages were equivalent to its findings in a Latin American village or highland Peru or whatever. And I guess I would ask you, and I hear these complaints about RCTs from people in the field of education, much like I heard them in the old days around college sophomores doing psychological testing, in psychological tests. So I wonder if you could stand outside of your shoes. You did, I think, a beautiful presentation on RCTs and pros and cons when you're in the space of believing that RCTs are the gold standard. But you've done enough of these that you could probably make the counterfactual argument that says that there are really problems with RCTs, but you didn't tell us those, other than budget size, severable units, and so on. So what's on a bad day, what's the critique?
So, right in your theme, I'll tell you the critique, and I'll tell you why it's just fundamentally flawed. The critique is that we'll often hear, and is this question of external validity. Can you take the study from Honduras and go to India? And this is a great question to ask about research and about evaluation. But there is nothing about randomization that helps or hurts that. If anything, it helps it a little bit. Let's not even go there. Let's just say it doesn't hurt. Right? Random assignment is not hurting external validity. There's just a basic question about knowing why is this working in Honduras, or I think we went from Uganda to Honduras. So why is it working in Uganda? What is the contextual factors that are necessary? What are the market conditions, if I want to think about it like an economist? But market conditions, I could be referring to a health and education thing too. And I'm just thinking broadly, like what are the factors that are at play that are necessary for making this be a good idea? And then what are the diagnostics I can do to assess the prevalence of those issues? And then I go to this other place and I find out whether they're true. I would do that process even if it was a non-experimental result. Right? You're not weaker on that process just because you have randomization. You're just stronger in that you have better internal validity in Uganda, so that when you go to Nicaragua, you at least have more confidence that with these 6 factors being true, that you got that result. So it doesn't. My response to this question is always like it's just one word is off on the question. It's a great question to ask. We absolutely have to do it. What is the external validity of the study, and what are the necessary factors that we have to understand about why this worked in order to take our lessons and give it legs and move it somewhere else. But randomization doesn't have anything to do with this. And that's the part that always amazes me in this conversation. And some of the answer is exactly what you said. Right? You said what happened in psychology. How are we going to solve this? Well, it's exactly with what you said happened. So you did all these stuff that you were part of and whatnot with experimental psychology in labs. And then someone said, maybe we should go and test this somewhere else. And voila, some of the things weren't holding. And people learned from that.
Okay, so can I try a follow-up? That's a very good answer. I have no disagreement with that answer. But tying it back indeed to the original example, it took years, decades, and I see the same trend actually right now. So this would be my answer to your answer, or my response, I should say. In the days when those studies were done that claimed that Ann Arbor college sophomores were the gold standard of what happens in the mind, and that we can, and in fact, you're right, they were a data point, and the data points could be compared and did get compared with data points around the world, and generalizability was then assessed. In the case of RCTs right now, since it's considered to be, it's a real growth industry, and in the development field, as people have come to think that it's very important, I find that your answer to me was not is a more sophisticated answer than the answer that the takeaway that people have when they read the literature. And in fact, I've been looking again at Duflo's book. One has the impression in her book, this is in the same spirit of using such designs, that the examples she gives in India are examples that then are the way we should be thinking about the development process. In other words, your answer to me, I think, was a very reasonable answer. But the public and the people who are more laypersons using RCTs and who read the word gold standard on the screen, their takeaway is that you have a general, meaning the field of social experiments, is trying to generalize more than, in fact, this was a study in Uganda, this was a study in Peru. I now have 2 data points. They both go in the same direction. Maybe this is an indication of the way the world works.
So for the record, I don't think. So I have one broad thought as to the source of the issue you're describing. But let me just start off by just saying I don't think I would have a single. I think I predict that my opinion, if you asked Esther for this question too, that we might phrase it differently, and she might say it with a French accent. But I suspect we would have this same exact answer. So she was my thesis advisor, and yeah. So, but not just that. I mean, so it's a spectrum, right? And so let me put this back into a different context. I get asked the following very practical question, which I think is fundamentally getting at your point, which is, when is enough to go to policy? Okay. And one of the reasons why I was excited about creating IPA when I first got it started, if I go back to my original email, which I sent to Esther, saying, here's what I think is a problem in this world, and what do you think about us creating this organization? I've already started the paperwork. Will you be on the board? Blah, blah, blah. Help us lead this thing and whatnot. One of the issues was lack of replication. Okay, and lack of saying, okay, fine, this worked in Uganda, we get it, that's great, you got a nice publication out of it, but we ought to go test this in Ecuador. Now, don't just go replicate for the sake of replication. It's not just to do it again and then have 2 data points, but it is about having some understanding of the theories and going to another place and seeing that it holds. But we do need more of that replication. And the fact is, the unfortunate fact in academia is we don't have quite the right incentives to do that. The policymakers and the donors want to see something done 6 times. You try publishing the 6th iteration of something in a top-tier journal, and you're not going to get tenure here at University of Pennsylvania. And that's a problem. And so one of the things that we've done at IPA is try to build an infrastructure to help make those things happen and make those replications happen. So, but back to your point, ultimately what you're asking me is, when is enough? And my answer to that is, I don't know. Every situation is going to be a little bit different. It depends on how simple the theory is, how complicated I think the contextual factors are that will make it work. But I can tell you that 1 is better than 0, 2 is better than 1, 3 is better than 2, and on and on. And I can tell you a second thing, which is I don't think the world should wait for action. Right? There's things that we need to be doing. When someone comes to me and he says, look, there's problems, I want to be someone who tries to work to solve them. I cannot wait 15 years for you guys to get your stuff in order and tell me like the definitive evidence. I'm going to take action now. What should I do? And I say, well, we got one study on this. There you go. That's better than 0. Go with that. So that's, I think, part of what you're picking up on in Banerjee and Duflo's book, right? Which is that there's things that were done once, good strong evidence. You want to solve that problem. Well, we got one data point on that. That's better than 0. The theory says these are the contexts. Go with it. Does that mean that they're opposed to seeing it tested the second or third or fourth time? Absolutely not. But it does mean that they're going to be faster to say, do that rather than this thing over here that has 0, or this thing over here which has been tested and didn't find an impact. So it's still maybe just 1 or 2 data points on evaluations, but it's better than 0. But they encourage replication. I mean, they're very fans of that as well. So, but we got to move forward. We got to do things, right? Don't want to. We would never tell Oxfam to just stop everything while we figured things out. Yeah.
I guess I had the flip side of that same question that Dan asked, actually, in accordance to what you just said, and now what you've just said. I might definitely agree that 1 is better than 0. But really, I mean, isn't it also true sometimes that the question ought to be asked, when is too much?
Mm-hmm.
So...
Absolutely. And it should be too much when we already, so let's go back to an example I gave, immunizations. Like, I'm not a doctor, maybe I'm going to give the wrong example, but like, some hepatitis vaccine or something like that. Like, I doubt we need more randomized trials in this. Maybe someone will tell me not, but let's just go with that and assume that to be true. It's too much. We already have the answer. But I do want to do a randomized trial in figuring out how to get households to finish immunizing their children and giving them the full sequence, because they come in, they get 1, and they don't come back for the second and third boosters that are necessary to complete the job. So I need to figure out how to do it. But I don't need to test that. I have the knowledge already.
Right. So getting back to Laura's question too, I was thinking the very same things because, I mean, when you design a project and you design a study around that project, and as you're doing so, so first you characterize your, sort of your intended audience or your population, right? So when is too much to say, well, I just need, in an RCT setting, let's say, is it okay just to have, 2 villages on each side to run the testing? Well, 1 plus 1. 1 that's control, 1 is the experiment. Would that, is that a respectable piece of...
No. No. I'd be shocked.
Numbers to put out there.
Yeah. But that's where you have to do a power calculation, and odds are that power calculation, with 1 and 1, if your unit is the village, no, that's a bad idea. It's the same. My children learned this long ago when they knew that I can't randomize over the 2 and like give 1 something and then the other not, and then see how they follow. I mean, yeah, they understand that random assignment's fair. That they got a long time ago. That's been drilled into them very hard. But they also, you need to do a power calculation, and if you only have 2 villages you're working in, then don't do a study. Yeah.
I just had a quick follow-up to something that you mentioned earlier regarding the 2 different scenarios of RCTs. The first where there's sort of decidedly uninformed consent, and the other where there's the public lottery. And so with the former, just sort of practically speaking, how does that, I mean, that seems like uninformed consent, but I guess it's technically sort of in terms of getting, approval from your institution or your funder, IRB, how does that work where the 500 villages who don't get the treatment are still doing your survey, perhaps without knowing that what you're doing, and so how does that work in terms of the practicalities of it?
So, look, first of all IRBs are very different across different universities, and IRBs are different within universities, as in, the random draw of who happens to be the one reviewing something. So you can get very different answers to this question depending on the context and whatnot. There are certainly situations where informing someone increases risk to them and does them harm, potentially. And so that the ethical thing to do would be to not inform and just do the survey. It's not hard to imagine situations where being informed of all sorts of details actually changes people's behavior in a way that imposes risks and does harm. And so that the ethical obligation should be to understand those things and assess that up front, and then act appropriately in the most ethical way to leave people as unharmed, untouched as possible from the research itself. A second thing to take into consideration is that there's often an important and serious separation. A lot of times the IRB does not have jurisdiction over, in fact, IRB never has jurisdiction over what a government does or what an NGO is doing. Right? That's not, they don't have rights on that. What they have jurisdiction to do and responsibility to do is to work with researchers to make sure researchers protect human rights. That's important. Right? But that's about human privacy, and that's about the researcher's contact and interaction with individuals. So in a case where there's clear separation, where there's a group, there's a firm doing something. So I've dealt with this with the microcredit example, for instance, where sometimes the IRB says, well, don't people have to consent to be part of the study from the firm's perspective? And I'm like, no. There's a firm that's going to go in and is going to randomize interest rates on a loan to test out sensitivity. This is a firm figuring out its demand curve. If American Express were to do this and share their data with me, American Express would never agree to first going to 1 million people that they're sending direct marketing to and saying, please sign this informed consent before we run a marketing test on you. That's insane. So it's no different in a developing country. There's a firm, it's choosing to test something, and that is intrusive not only in a bad way from a cost perspective to the firm, but actually doing harm in that it's getting in the way of their relationship with their clients in an unnatural way. Whereas the thing they're doing is operating their business in a way that is the way they choose to operate it. And the IRB of a university back here does not have jurisdiction telling some firm how they have to, what types of things they have to put into their disclosure policies when they make loans. Now, what they do have jurisdiction on, and what is important, is to guide the researcher in our interaction with households. So we're going to do a survey, and we're going to get informed consent. And we're going to make sure that they are fully informed and cooperative. And if they don't want to cooperate, they don't cooperate. That's their choice, right? And at no time is anybody forced into cooperating or whatnot. So that's kind of the short answer. But frankly, there's a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of imperialism in this space that I've seen.